न सद्वासद्यदपि परमं वेदवातन्न वेद यत्सत्यं तन्न खलु कुशलैश्छिद्यते तर्कबाणैः द्वैताद्वैतात्यखिलमतिभिर्यत्पदं सेव्यते तत् वन्दे चेतो विलयनिलयं शारदापादपद्मम् सांख्यं योगं पशुपतिमतं वैष्णवं वा यथेच्छं चार्वाकं वा भवतु हृदयाह्लादकं सज्जनानां यत्सत्यं तत् प्रमितिपथगं स्वप्रकाशं वरेण्यं दद्याच्छौख्यं जगति सकलं darshanam sharadaya. Thank you, Professor Anand Vaidya. Professor Anand Vaidya is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy at San Jose State University and Visiting Professor of Philosophy at University of California, Los Angeles. His research is focused on the cross-cultural and multidisciplinary study of mind, knowledge, and reality. He works on perception, consciousness, knowledge, and critical thinking in Indian and analytic philosophy. Currently, he is writing 2 books, one on the importance of Indian epistemology and critical thinking for the contemporary world, another on the moral and mental lives of machines. He regularly teaches courses in his research areas as well as business ethics and the philosophy of economics. He organizes conferences in India and America, and he travels and lectures widely. He received his PhD from University of California, Santa Barbara, for his work on 2-dimensional model logic. Personally, the name Anand Jayaprakash Vaidya resonates something deep and meaningful to me. Since the day I met him, I have found him inspiring and always pushing me to work as a team, as a community. Anand Vaidya is an exceptional person for a philosopher who happens to be a community builder. And he is a very broad and open-minded. He has the deepest knowledge and model logic. I don't even know what that is, but he's as open to learn from all the disciplines, and particularly he's deeply involved and interested in bringing Indian philosophy in the global stage. And my praise to you, Professor Vaidya. So now the ice is yours. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much for that great introduction, and thank you for allowing me to be here, Acharya. Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Is that the next step for me? Okay, let's share a screen. Good, and let me go to play from the start. Okay, good. So thank you very much for having me here to give this talk. It will be the first in a series of 4 talks I'm giving in May on the same topic. Here first at Vimarsha, the next one at Oxford, the next one at Rome, and finally in Kerala at the end of the month. So I'm looking for everyone's feedback, and I hope you enjoy this. If you are familiar with work by scholars in the 20th century about Indian philosophy and its interaction with analytic philosophy, you might notice that the title of my paper is closely related to an issue that was raised by Karl Popper in epistemology when he investigated the question, does Indian epistemology concern the justified true belief theory of knowledge? And then in that paper, he carefully went through and diagnosed the relationship between what Indian epistemologists in the classical period were involved in and what was going on with contemporary debates, and then tried to talk about what relation could be obtained between the classical period and contemporary work. This was around the 1980s, actually, in analytic epistemology. So I'm sort of trying to be interested in the same thing. I'm interested in the relationship between what is going on in Indian philosophy of mind, in particular in the Vedanta schools, and whether or not that concerns the hard problem of consciousness as it's understood circa the 1990s and moving forward. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So I just like to start by saying what my theses are. Although there is a growth in the production of Vedantic theories that could be applied to the hard problem of consciousness in analytic philosophy, you can see that there's a volume of the Monists dedicated to this. I have a paper in it. It's by Janardhan Ganeri and Itay Shahani. I would say that Vedantic philosophy was not, however, Vedantic philosophy was not interested in this problem. It was interested in the hard problem of the self, something analytic philosophy is only discovering now. Neither Shankara nor Ramanuja's opposing theories of Vedanta are really appropriate for solving the hard problem of consciousness. However, Ramanuja's theory at least fits the frame of the hard problem of consciousness. Shankara's theory does not fit the frame, even if we can bend it to fit the frame. So in some sense, what I want to do is something that is very critical, actually, of my own early work, because I was actually a very big proponent of the view that we ought to be exploring Vedantic theories of consciousness as we explore the development of recent theories addressing the hard problem of consciousness. I still agree that that is the correct thing to be doing, but I think that we need to raise the bar of the level of engaging with our classical theories and making sure that we're actually getting the right details from them to apply them to the hard problem of consciousness. But in more specific detail, I want to advocate for the view that what we could kind of do instead is say that instead of applying our theories to the hard problem of consciousness, we could try to attract people from other traditions of philosophy to address the problem that actually the classical Indian philosophers were interested in, which I will call the hard problem of self. So I will contrast the hard problem of the self with the hard problem of consciousness and try to drive the literature going forward away from trying to build Indian theories that answer the hard problem of consciousness to drawing analytic philosophers and phenomenologists to the hard problem of the self, which is a problem well defined in Indian philosophy and only recently something that analytic philosophers are coming to. And I'll explain how the analytic philosophers are carefully stumbling their way into this problem that was very clearly articulated early on and is very present in the Vedantic period, in the Vedantic traditions. Okay, so the outline will be what is the hard problem of consciousness and the definition of the terms it uses as understood in analytic philosophy, since it's an analytical problem. Then I want to give a brief history of how we got to the introduction of Vedanta into the conversation, which is now growing very well. And in fact, I will soon be starting to try and get an entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on classical Indian theories of panpsychism as it pertains and generally to philosophy of mind as a way of showing the growth in that area of research. And then I want to talk about two views of how to use Shankara's Advaita, and then an argument about why Shankara's Advaita cannot really address the hard problem of consciousness. Then I'll say why Ramanuja's Vishishta Advaita can address the hard problem of consciousness, although I will still say there that there are some ways in which it's not really appropriate for it. And then I'll close by defending what the hard problem of consciousness is in a way that I think is helpful for everyone to see something coming from Indian philosophy that could be used to attract other traditions to our problem, rather than us going with our theories towards the problems that we find in analytical philosophy or in phenomenological philosophy. Okay, so let's just start with what the definition is. And these are definitions taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy in order to show that the state of the art as defined in the place where the people go to look for what people are talking about, other than in David Chalmers' classic papers on this, it just says these things, and this is the terms we have to use. The hard problem of consciousness is to explain why and how humans and other organisms have qualia, phenomenal consciousness, or subjective experience. So that's what the problem is. It's oftentimes contrasted with the easy problems. I won't go into that contrast right now, but if you want to understand how the name hard applies to the problem of consciousness, you can look at it in relationship to what Dave calls the easy problems, okay? What's more important to me is that there are definitions of terms that are used to characterize what we're talking about when we're talking about the hard problem of consciousness in English. And so just as when we're talking about problems in Sanskritic philosophy, we're very careful to understand what those words mean in Sanskrit, we need to understand what the words in English mean when these people are exploring their problem. So the qualitative character of experience is often equated with so-called raw feels and illustrated by the redness one experiences when one looks at ripe tomatoes, or the specific sweet savor one encounters when one tastes an equally ripe pineapple. The relevant sort of qualitative character is not restricted to sensory states, but is typically taken to be present as an aspect of experiential states in general, such as experienced thoughts or desires. So a couple of key things here is that raw feels are relevant. And number two, it is not necessarily tied to a sensory state, because there is something called cognitive phenomenology, not just sensory phenomenology. And cognitive phenomenology is phenomenology that doesn't reduce to sensory phenomenology. So we have to be careful of that distinction. Okay. Then we have something called, in this definition of the hard problem, the phenomenal structure of experience is richly intentional. And again, that's the key word here, and involves not only sensory ideas and qualities, but complex representations of time, space, cause, body, self, world, and the organized structure of lived reality in all its conceptual and non-conceptual forms. And then we have the subjective aspect of experience in contemporary analytic philosophy is the what it's like aspect of experience. That term was introduced by Thomas Nagel in a paper he wrote called What It's Like to Be a Bat in the 70s. Subjective experience requires a first-person point of view of what it's like to undergo the experience. The claim was that although we might try to imagine what it's like to echolocate the way that a bat can echolocate, we have no understanding from the first-person perspective of what it's like to have information processed through echolocation as a way of navigating in space. And so his core idea was that there's a what it's like aspect of experience, and that's capturing the subjective experience of it. Now, there is interesting work in analytic philosophy on exactly what the what it's like aspect of experience is in relationship to subjective experience. But the key thing I want to take away from these definitions is that the problem in analytic philosophy is basically defined in terms of the hardness of giving an account in humans and other organisms, typically non-human animals, at least us, including vertebrates, if not also invertebrates, given the research that's recently come out from NYU about invertebrate consciousness and insect consciousness. But basically, this thing, we have to control that problem in terms of the terms that are actually used. And those are the terms that I've just gone over. So we have qualitative character, we have phenomenal structure, and we have subjective what it's like aspect of experience. Okay. Now, the story begins with an initial argument that was given against physicalism by David Chalmers in roughly 1996. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I became fascinated with this problem and started doing research on it. And I'll run through the argument and explain the structure of what he's doing here. The first thing I want you to note in order to set up the end of my talk is I want you to recognize that no part of this argument mentions anything about the nature of the self. Okay, so this argument actually is absent any considerations of the self. It's just about the nature of consciousness. So the first claim is I can conceive of a zombie, a physical duplicate of myself lacking phenomenal consciousness. If I can conceive of X without Y, then it's possible for X to exist without Y. So it's possible for a zombie to exist. If physicalism is true, then it's necessarily true. That is, it's impossible for there to be a zombie, a physical duplicate of me that lacks phenomenal consciousness. So physicalism is false. So the key structure of the argument is that some kind of imaginative exercise called conceiving allows you to conceive coherently of something that is a particle by particle or piece by piece physical duplicate of yourself, but we've deleted away the consciousness that you have. So you're conscious right now. Let's say that the credence for your consciousness right now is 1. The highest credence you can give is that you're conscious now listening to my lecture. And then what you say is, I imagine, I conceive of a duplicate of me, part by part duplicate of me, and I delete away the consciousness that I have present in my own case. And that twin of me, twin Dave, for example, lacks phenomenal consciousness, but as a physical duplicate. Then there's a move that says conceiving goes to possibility. So it's possible for the zombie to exist. And then the further interesting claim is at 4, which some people claim is the idea that physicalism, if everything is physical and reduces to the physical, then that's a necessary truth. It couldn't have been otherwise. Then given the conceivability of a zombie, we can then refute the idea that physicalism is true. Okay, so that's Dave's initial argument. And then in his initial work, he did a very nice thing. He said, okay, here's an argument. And now here are 6 ways you can react to his argument. And that articulation of these positions set up a trajectory for researchers to then spend time thinking about what was good and bad about the argument. So we'll run through quickly and we'll focus on one of them for the rest of this talk. So in the early period, most of the discussion was about type A and type B materialism. So type A materialism is the view that it is not conceivable that there be duplicates of conscious beings that have absent or inverted conscious states. So the idea is that in premise 1, you say it's conceivable that zombies exist. And in type A materialism just says, no, it's not conceivable. That's the first reaction to the argument. Type B says that zombies are conceivable, but they're not metaphysically possible, right? So these are both ways of resisting the kind of initial steps of the argument. So type A say not conceivable zombies, type B, it is conceivable, but it's not possible. And type C says that it's conceivable for us now, but as we learn more about physics, for example, because currently we're in a state where physics is incomplete. So as we approach what's known as complete physics, or we take the position of what's known as promissory note materialism or promissory note physicalism, which says things we know right now won't be contradicted, but in the future we'll complete physics. Type C materialism is saying that in the future we won't be able to conceive of something. So all the first 3 things are about the conceivability. So in my research, in my dissertation, I basically looked at type B materialism because my hypothesis was that the theory of using 2-dimensional modal logic in David Chalmers' work to explain how conceivability is tied to metaphysical possibility is refutable by using techniques in mathematical logic. So I wrote my dissertation on just showing that the principle that says if it's conceivable, then it's metaphysically possible is false by using a technique in mathematical logic using transitive frames. So that was what my dissertation was about. It wasn't really about the consciousness part. It was just about the link between conceivability and possibility. Now, the other things on the other side of the view are called non-reductive views. So one thing is type D dualism, which is a view that in some sense is tied to Descartes' interactionist dualism. But Dave himself in his book, The Conscious Mind, defends a form of naturalistic dualism. And it's nice to contrast the dualism that Dave talks about with the kind of dualism we found in the Samkhya tradition. In fact, Karen Pop O'Brien has written a very nice paper called The Hard Problem of Pure Consciousness, where she compares the kind of dualism and consciousness that's in relationship between Purusha and Prakriti in Samkhya with what's going on in Dave's naturalistic dualism from his 1996 book. Type E is known as epiphenomenalism, and that's the idea that physical states have an effect on phenomenal properties, that is the conscious states that we have, but there's no downward causation. Consciousness doesn't have any effect on the physical, which seems weird if you agree with someone like Princess Elizabeth, who objected to Descartes and told us that basically it's not only the case that sometimes when I put my hand in the fire, I have a conscious state, but also that when I go through conscious decision-making, that conscious decision-making gets my body to move. So if you believe in upward and downward causation, then epiphenomenalism seems to be in direct contradiction with that. In dualism, the problem is how do you explain interaction causally in both directions? But type E just fundamentally denies downward causation. So the thing we're going to focus on is what is known as type F monism. On this view, phenomenal or proto-phenomenal properties are located at the fundamental level of physical reality, and in a certain sense, underlie physical reality itself. So if you sort of already know something about classical Indian philosophy, you might think, oh, Indian philosophy, aside from fitting in the camp of dualism through Sankhya, is going to fit somewhere in F. And so that's, but again, I want to point out, in the initial stage in 1996, there is no discussion of the self in setting up the hard problem of consciousness. And we'll see that again in the next argument. So then came along roughly around, I think, 2006, just after I got out of graduate school, another argument that comes from Galen Strawson. And here again, he has a very interesting way of supporting a kind of view in the type F space. So he says either consciousness is emergent from something non-conscious or it is fundamental to the universe. That's the second disjunct, is the type F case. Extension in space cannot emerge from non-extended points. We can't conceive it. What is he talking about? If you're in a Euclidean geometry, points are defined as having zero extension, but all real lines have extension. So he's saying we can't conceive of how something with no extension can aggregate together to make extended points. So we can't understand how a real line can come from something like a Euclidean point. So he thinks the emergence of consciousness from non-conscious matter is like the case of extension from non-extension. So consciousness cannot emerge from non-conscious matter. So consciousness is fundamental. And then he makes his caveat, at least in the sense of micropsychism, which simply requires that at least some entities at the fundamental level are conscious. Okay, so the idea is that there's got to be something down there that's already got the property such that when we aggregate up in some way, we can get consciousness out as an emergent thing. Otherwise, we're in the case of trying to build a real line from non-extended points, and that doesn't make any sense. But again, if you look at this argument, 2 points to make. One, it doesn't mention anything about the self. Although Galen Strawson has brilliant papers about the self, in this specific argument, he doesn't make any reference to the self when talking about the emergence of consciousness. And in addition, if you look at Galen Strawson's argument, you will recognize, if you know the history of Indian philosophy, that the kind of points that he is making here are pretty much well established in a series of authors in the history of Indian philosophy. So I would at least put Sri Ramakrishna in this camp. I would put Sri Aurobindo in this camp, Swami Vivekananda in this camp. To a certain degree, I would put Abhinavagupta in this camp. I would put some other Kashmiri Shaivists in this camp. I think a lot of Indian philosophers in the classical period and later were interested already and aware of the idea that consciousness kind of has three properties. It has a constitution property. Consciousness can constitute reality. It has a generative property. Consciousness can generate reality in the emergent sense or in the non-emergent sense, in the grounding sense. And also it has the realization property. Consciousness is something that can be realized at different degrees and different levels of higher consciousness. So those three properties seem to be something that a lot of Indian philosophers were well aware of and really operated with. And it isn't really in analytic philosophy, I think, until Michael Lockwood, maybe in the 70s, but really in more clear sense in Galen Strawson in 2006, that this comes in to the discussion. So then one of the people working in this space, Sam Coleman, wrote an objection to the micropsychist position defended by Galen Strawson. And in his work, we see the first time where something about the notion of the self comes in. But notice it comes in as an objection to micropsychism, not as a positive sort of constraint on theorizing initially. So he says, micropsychism is true only if it can show how microconscious entities can combine together to make macroconscious entities like a human. Remember, the point of the hard problem of consciousness isn't to tell us that there are basic particles of consciousness at the fundamental level, but to explain how human-like consciousness, which has phenomenal structure, qualitative character, and what it's like subjective aspect, holds. So if you have micropsychism, it's not going to help unless it can explain the macro states that humans have. Then he says, in order for microconscious entities to combine to form a macroconscious entity, the perspectives of each microconscious entity must be preserved when combined. So if you're doing a combinatoric theory of aggregation, if you're aggregating these microconscious entities with either other microconscious entities or non-conscious entities, then the perspective of each microconscious entity must be preserved. And why is that? Because consciousness is, as we learned from phenomenologists, perspectival. Every conscious thing that a human has is from a certain perspective, and that perspective has to be preserved. So he says, 3, combination does not preserve perspective. And this is a very simple thing. If two people are looking at a circular object that is blue, one from perspective A and one from perspective B, when we combine their perspectives in together to form a perspective C, we will notice that logically we lose perspective A and perspective B. perspective A and perspective B are gone when they are merged together to make perspective C. So combination as a technique of putting micropsychist entities together doesn't preserve perspectivalness. So actually, those perspectives, those consciousnesses are fused together. They're not combined. And then we need a model of how fusion occurs as opposed to combination, right? It's not aggregation through combination. If anything, it's aggregation through fusion. But fusion isn't a preservation of perspective relation. So macro-conscious entities cannot be explained through combination in the sense of aggregation without fusion from micro-conscious entities. So even if consciousness is fundamental, it is not fundamental in virtue of an atomistic metaphysics of consciousness. So you can see here that something about the nature of the self perceiving at the macro-conscious level is driving the way in which we understand a constraint on why micropsychism possibly can't hold, or anything in the micropsychist. And there's a lot of interesting research now going on between scholars of Indian philosophy who want to use techniques from Buddhism. So for example, Moni Machada has a wonderful paper on micropsychism articulated in some way that voices some Buddhist philosophers. And Amit Chaturvedi is working on a response to this to understand this from the perspectives of Utpaladeva and other Buddhist people. So there's a lot of interesting work here now. Because we've introduced the notion of the self, it's sort of grappleable by like what Indian philosophers would be thinking about. Okay, so then Philip Goff came along a little bit later. He was working with all these people early on, but then he came along and made an argument for what's called cosmopsychism. He said the real combination problem occurs only if one holds it that there are micro-conscious entities that combine together to form macro-conscious entities, such as in the case of human consciousness. Atomistic metaphysics is not the only option for thinking about the fundamental level where consciousness resides. Instead, one can hold that there's a unified field of consciousness as opposed to bits of micro-conscious entities. So given the real combination problem, cosmopsychism, the view that fundamental level there is a single unified whole consciousness, a universal consciousness seems to be a better option to pursue. The whole is prior to the parts. So Philip says basically you can avoid the real combination problem by getting rid of the attempt to have atoms of microconscious entities that are combined together through some form of non-fusion aggregation. And instead you can go to a unified consciousness. And so right about here, type F monism, which is what Dave said is one way to react to his argument, starts to look like something that is really prevalent in a lot of traditions in Indian philosophy. So cosmopsychism is a name coming from Philip Goff, and it's a kind of panpsychism according to the analytic taxonomy. And panpsychism is just sort of like literally means sort of like everything has mentality or psyche to it in some sense. And then he basically says that one way to argue for this is to use Jonathan Schaffer's technique of priority monism, which is the idea that the whole is prior to the parts. The whole grounds the part division. So this is a way of escaping this problem of constructing the self from an atomistic metaphysics that involves only micropsychist entities. Okay, and then a little bit later, Miri al-Bahari comes along and says, okay, well, that's true. Cosmopsychism holds that there's a unified field of consciousness from which each macro-conscious entity is derived, right? So again, we still want to explain, again, the hard problem is how do you explain human level consciousness? Well, human level consciousness is not the unified field of consciousness, it's more parochial or localized. If micropsychism faces the combination problem because of atomistic metaphysics, then cosmopsychism faces the decombination problem. How do we get from a unified field of consciousness to individual conscious minds? In order to divide down a unified consciousness, must supply each individual consciousness with its own perspective. However, a unified consciousness cannot yield a subject of consciousness unproblematically, so cosmopsychism is equally problematic. So Miri al-Bahari is picking up on a theme that's already in Freya Matthews called the subject individuation problem. So we'll get into that technical distinction in a moment, but I can summarize again by pointing out that Miri, actually, we're going to talk about her theory, which is influenced a lot by Advaita Vedanta, is inserting something about the nature of the self to cause a problem for the cosmopsychist picture. So what happened is we have these two theories against physicalism and pro fundamentality type F monism from Chalmers and Strawson. And then what happens is that Coleman and Goff and then Meary come along and they bring in considerations about the nature of the self to drive towards other views. And so the integration of thinking about the self at a macro level or consciousness at the level of human selves is what drives the argument forward deeper into the space of analytic panpsychism. So we can summarize carefully. Micropsychism, how do we get from the little bits up to a unified self? And then in cosmopsychism, how do we get from the unified field of consciousness down to the individual selves? So those are the problems that currently face analytic panpsychism. Everyone recognizes them, and in the literature they're well known. And now Indian philosophers have been spending time working on how to use theories from Indian philosophy to help explain answers to these questions. That's like a big sort of movement that's happened. I initially was part of this. I mean, I still am, but I initially helped start this movement with an article I wrote on looking at 3 types of theories in Indian philosophy and Vedanta. But I think a lot of people have taken it much further, and it's a growing area engaging Indian philosophy and comparative philosophy. So just to be clear, though, because we're going to be focusing on cosmopsychism, because that's the one that's most closely related, in my opinion, to many theories in classical Indian philosophy, although I think you can find versions of micropsychism in classical Indian philosophy also. There are 3 questions that oftentimes aren't distinguished in the analytical literature, but Swami Medhananda and I have discussed these 3 questions, and we agree that there are 3 different questions. So is combination or decombination modally coherent? This is like a how possible, like how is it possible for a unified field of consciousness to decompose to get the unified things, or how is it possible for combination to occur? You can do it in both directions. Then the second question is the mechanical generation question. So what if it's possible? What is the mechanism for combination or decom? What is the thing that brings about? What drives it? And then there's a metaphysical explanation question. Why does combination or decombination occur? What is it about what's going on that would make it the case that combination or decombination should occur? I mean, if something is emerging from something else, what is the explanation of the emergence in the first place? And if something is decombining down, what is it? And so what I want to clarify a distinction between what's going on in the analytic literature and what we find if we just look in the Indian philosophical literature. The analytic literature, for my part, has always been mostly focused on the first question. So if you look at the work of Philip Goff on inheritance for decombination and how inheritance can give us an account of how decombination happens, he's mostly focused on the modal coherence question. What I find, though, oftentimes is that analytic philosophers are trying to show how is it possible for something to happen through a variety of arguments. But the Indian philosophy people don't really spend a lot of time talking about that explicitly. Rather, they specifically talk about the mechanical generation question, like what is the mechanism for how this happens, and the metaphysical explanation for it. And I think that part of the reason why is because the analytic discussion, for the most part, until recently, pursues panpsychism or cosmopsychism atheistically, while Indian philosophy, at least in the Vedanta tradition, pursues it theistically. And so there's a current movement that has been going on for probably about 3 years where people are merging the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of mind. The next conference I'm presenting the same talk at Oxford is dedicated to showing how looking at stuff in the philosophy of religion and in Indian philosophy can help inform some of these discussions and move us away from just the modal coherence question to the mechanical generation and metaphysical explanation question. So I, and at least Swami Medhananda, agree that there's more than one question here that cosmopsychism or micropsychism faces. So Miri al-Bahari is probably the one person who is pushed hardest for the introduction of Advaita Vedanta into the discussion of the hard problem. The questions of combination and decombination, she claims, rest on realism about subjectivity in the self, that there is a self in some sense which is real, that we need to account for and recover. I don't think she says this explicitly, but my analysis of her work shows that there's an implicit characterization in the background, so I'll take sort of blame if this isn't really found literally in her text. However, I think she does claim if the self and subjectivity are an illusion, we merely have two competing explanations of consciousness, one proceeding from the bottom up and the other from the top down. We don't really need to explain a real self. We need to explain only the illusion of the self and subjectivity. Subjective experience is no longer in need of a real explanation because it isn't real. This changes the structure of what we're doing. So if we're looking and we're saying we have to recover a real self with real perspectives, then the job of doing that seems to me somewhat different than if what we're saying is we just have to explain the illusion of the self at a certain level of explanation and the illusion of a self at that same explanation from a different direction. So decombination goes from the unified field to an illusory self, and combination goes from elementary particles that are real to the illusion of a self and another. So we have two competing directions, but we're not solving for the real self, we're solving for an illusory self, okay? And so this is interesting, actually, because this way of seeing the illusory self and the illusory qualities maybe is something that I think is of current interest right now. So again, we'll go back to Philip Goff, but I recently was reading his most recent paper that came out in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and he offers a very new theory of cosmopsychism, very different from what he defended in his book and his initial theory about decombination through inheritance from grounding. He says, I will develop a new hybrid of the strong and weak emergentist forms of panpsychism. He's just talking about cosmopsychism here, really. A view according to which subjects of experience are strongly emergent, but their phenomenal properties are weakly emergent. Okay, so in some sense, I can tell you what that means. If something is strongly emergent, that leans a little bit more towards the idea that it's illusory. So subjects of experience, the self, is strongly emergent in the sense that it's kind of illusory in a certain way, but their phenomenal properties are weakly emergent because, and being weakly emergent, that they're less sort of illusory than the self. I will argue that this hybrid view manages to avoid both the challenges facing physicalism and dualism and the analogs of those challenges that seem to undermine standard forms of panpsychism. So he's going for a new view. And then I think it's actually a very interesting question. How does this sit in relation to Vedantic forms of cosmopsychism? This is an interesting and pressing question about the development of analytic cosmopsychism in relationship to Indian. So again, I would say in some sense that the move from the kind of picture that Philip had initially to this move can suggest some relationships with Vedantic theories in a closer matching relationship than actually what I'm going to argue for today as the problem. So he says nicely, according to hybrid cosmopsychism, there are basic laws ensuring that in certain conditions, new conscious subjects, new phenomenal property bearers, emerge from the universe. Now, there's a question about whether or not that means they're an illusion or not, but I generally take that grounding is a relationship where you can have the ground and the grounded both be real, but emergence is a way of saying that something in a certain sense is not real. So I didn't really track whether or not he wants the new conscious subjects to be real in a certain sense or not. But I would say that there's a way of reading a new conscious subject as being kind of emergently illusory in some sense, or being a new conscious subject that's real. But that's a detail that someone has to go through. But these strong emergent subjects do not appear with their own phenomenal property instances. Rather, they inherit phenomenal property instances which previously belonged to. So he's borrowing from his inheritance theory. That is to say, there are phenomenal properties P1, P2, Pn, and an emergent subject E, such that at a time P, T1, P2, Pn belong to the universe, and at a later time T2, P1, P2, Pn cease to belong to the universe and instead belong to E. As E persists through time, it continues to possess a small bubble of the phenomenal properties of the fundamental fields, constantly gaining some from losing some back to the universe around the edges. At the moment E ceases to be a conscious entity in its own right, perhaps at the death of the organism, it relinquishes its phenomenal properties back to the universe. In this way, although there are strongly emergent subjects, there are no strongly emergent phenomenal properties. Rather, phenomenal properties of the fundamental fields are transferred from the universe, subject to emergent subjects, before being relinquished back to the universe. So I don't know if you can see some of the sort of ways in which this could tie into a kind of theory and Vedantic stuff, where like each of us is a drop in the pond of the universe or the ocean of the universe. You can see something like that going on. But of course, my main claim in a lot of my talk today is that in order to work out these relationships with Indian philosophy, we need very good translations of the Sanskrit terms, and we need to be very careful about problems that can occur because things look similar at a structural level, but the details of what's going on are really not there. So going back to Miri, she says before this paper came out, like long ago, like almost 10 years ago, 2014 maybe, she says that the best way to go forward once we have the decombination problem on the table is to go to a non-dual fundamental ontology. Non-dual consciousness without a subject is fundamental and all that is real. One consequence of the lack of a subject for fundamental consciousness is that fundamental consequence is aperspectival, since perspectives attach to subjects and not to non-dual consciousness without a subject. All subjects of experience are perspectival, and as individual subjects, illusory. This is what she says. One consequence of the illusory nature of individual subjects is that their conscious experience, insofar as it attaches to their individual subjectivity, is an illusion. So she is straightforwardly advancing what she calls the perennial philosophy found in the work of Aldous Huxley, of which she thinks many traditions contribute to, and she clearly thinks Advaita Vedanta contributes to this. And the version she uses of cosmopsychism from Vedanta is, I think, closely related to Shankara's Advaita. And according to that, we're going to at least pick out the following things. Brahman lacks qualities, lacks intentionality because it lacks the subject-object dichotomy, but is nevertheless universal, eternal, and unchanging. The individual self and the totality of what the individual self experiences is illusory, and you can put in the caveat in some sense. That's something to be figured out. And as I just said before, there is a connection to Goff's current view that is worth exploring. I'm not sure. I'm currently working on it to see exactly where it lines up with maybe some of what Shankara says. But I think there is something going on with this idea that the self is strongly emergent, but qualities are weakly emergent. We have to understand what strong emergence is and weak emergence is. Maybe Goff's view, in some sense, opposes some aspects of what Shankara goes in for, but at the same time, maybe it accepts some aspects of what he does go in for. So it's an interesting comparative project just between Goff and Shankara's Advaita, I think. That's a new thing because he just published this paper, like, I think a month ago. So witness consciousness is the core idea found in Sankhya philosophy and also in Advaita. And Al-Bahari has a theory of it. She says witness consciousness carries an intrinsic phenomenal character, which might be described as a luminosity that's unborrowed from any particular sensory or cognitive modality. The metaphor of light to describe consciousness commonly deployed across traditions is, for instance, used contrastively by Western philosophers when describing philosophical zombies, behavior duplicates of us that lack any inner conscious life as all dark inside. Yet while taking in various sensory or cognitive imagery as direct objects of its illumination, witnessing does not illuminate itself as such as an object, but is nevertheless immediately aware of its own presence as the source. So I understand this sort of like claim about what witness consciousness is. I disagree with the idea that light is in any sense relevant here, because auditory perception doesn't have any light aspect to it. Light is a part of the visual channel. And so I can understand zombies in terms of the lack of auditory experience. So this idea of illumination and light doesn't work actually for me. So I would object to this way of characterizing what philosophical zombies are by saying all dark inside. The dark there is not really a darkness of light. I think it's something else. And I think it's same in the Indian traditions, talking about the light really isn't going to help when we're talking about the absence of what's going on in the auditory channel. So I don't think the metaphor of light is helpful here, actually. I think it's confusing to people who are not looking at the details of what might really matter. So she says this about witness consciousness and solving the hard problem. The Advaitin is left with the formidable task of explaining just how such non-dual consciousness could coherently ground our individual conscious perspectives and their contents, as well as the objects that we take to be our mind-independent environment. We can conceive of a scenario wherein one comes to experience what is an objectless mode of witness consciousness, such that it presents a subjectless and such that it presents as subjectless and aperspectival. And might such a mode of pure witnessing also present as being unconfined by spatial, temporal, and imagistic parameters, as well as hyperreal in a way that is suggestive of its ultimacy? So she's recognizing that we have to say something more in order to make sense of this theory. And actually, what I really think is nice is that she gives an argument. for how to think about witness consciousness. Now, to sort of tell you how this argument works in a way that makes sense to an analytic philosopher, I will point out that she is using a conceivability argument like David Chalmers and like Galen Strawson, and saying that if they can use conceivability arguments to make sense of a phenomenon, then it's clear that it would be okay for me to try and do that same way. But I just want to point out that I don't really find in Indian philosophy that any theorist attempts to get at this idea of witness consciousness through a conceivability argument. I don't see the use of conceivability arguments even in the defense of dualism in Indian philosophy. So Dharmakirti defends dualism by talking about what it takes for the Buddha to have infinite compassion across many lives. He doesn't use conceivability at all. He just uses the fact that the Buddha has infinite compassion and it takes more than one lifetime to have that, and therefore we have to explain it in terms of the body being sufficient for one lifetime, but not for enough lifetimes to have infinite compassion. So this is the conceivability argument she offers, and she says, although we cannot positively conceive of non-dual pure witness consciousness that is beyond space and time and all qualities, we can negatively conceive of it through a thought experiment that involves deleting what is present in perspectival object-dependent experience and what is associated with such perceptual sensory. So you put yourself in a sensory deprivation chamber and you slowly delete away all the things that you see and all the things you can feel and all the things you can hear. And she says, there is no contradiction of the form present in the claim that a circle square exists in the claim that consciousness exists without objects. If there is no contradiction in the claim, then it's prima facie negatively conceivable. So it's prima facie negatively conceivable. The consciousness without any objects can exist. So basically she's saying consciousness is not always consciousness of something, it's awareness only. And the great Acharya Stanishwar Timilsina has actually written a very nice book about the whole debate about awareness only consciousness, which I'm not citing today, but great to hear what he has to say about this. I don't think that the arguments that he would have covered in his book would cover this conceivability argument. So the idea is that this argument, I would say, like conceivability arguments, isn't really that valuable. And basically, based on my dissertation, the reason why is that in some sense, conceivability arguments tells us what is logically or conceptually possible. But what many philosophers are interested in is what is metaphysically possible or necessary. And in my dissertation, I argued that these style arguments give us more of a wide grasp about the limits of conceptualization and logical constraints, but they don't give us access to what's metaphysically real. And because of the concern with that, I think this argument will generally fall short, even if the details here are presented very nicely. So this is my dress up of what's going on in her argument. Right, okay. So, so there's an alternative version that I recently seen came out in 2023 from 3 philosophers from India, where they actually try to make a cosmopsychist version of Advaita Vedanta. And they say some very interesting things because they say how their view is different from Al-Bahari's. And I think in a lot of ways, they're trying to do some additional kind of work that can help the view get off the ground. So they say, we attempt to show that the insights from Advaita Vedanta could, notice, help to address the troubles faced by cosmopsychism. However, unlike Al-Bahari, our approach treats Advaita Vedanta as a form of cosmopsychism, one where the universal consciousness is not subject, but very much the source of the individual consciousness of the empirical subjects. It may be that the decombination problem as defined by Al-Bahari does not arise for Advaita Vedanta, because when you move beyond to an aperspectival base, you walk around the problem. But according to us, Advaita Vedanta does have to address Nagasawa and Wagner's called the derivation problem, the problem explaining how the individual consciousness derived from the universe. So again, they're saying that there's still a question here, and I think that question fits in the 3 questions I asked about cosmopsychism. Their question might be in the generation issue. So they nicely say, Advaita Vedanta holds the individual consciousness to be an instance of reflection of the universal consciousness in the buddhi, the instrument of cognition possessed by sentient beings that is comparable to the modern concept of mind, with the exception that it is not considered to be intrinsically consciousness. That's the Sankhya sort of idea. The Laghu Vakya Vritti, an Advaita Vedantic test traditionally attributed to Shankara, illustrates how an otherwise insentient buddhi is rendered conscious by illumined by the pure consciousness Brahman, and how it turns it acquires the ability to illumine external. So again, the idea is that there's an illumination property and a light property, and the lighting up is going to do the work. So just pick up that they are picking up on another factor that is not really, is discussed in Al-Bahari, but they're kind of pushing on this more. They say, water heated on fire acquires heat and so becomes capable of heating the body. In like manner, the intellect, illumined by pure consciousness, acquires its luster and thereby illumines all other external objects. So again, it's something about illumination is going to do the work. I'll get into this in my objections. And they say nicely, evidently the buddhi in Advaita Vedanta is presumed to be made of a special material substance, making it capable of reflecting the universal consciousness or being illumined by it. The conception of buddhi and the idea of reflection, in addition to addressing the derivation problem, allow Advaita Vedanta to explain how only the sentient beings are able to tap into the universal consciousness and not the inerrant objects, although both of them are grounded in universal. That's a very good point. That's because it's not clear actually that any Advaita Vedanta or any Vedanta view is a form of panpsychism, because according to the Indian traditions, in their views of consciousness as being fundamental, some things show up as being insentient and some things show up as being sentient. But if you had like an integrated information theory of consciousness, you might think that everything has some degree of consciousness because it has some degree of integrated information across integration and information. And so that's not the kind of view that can fit with Advaita Vedanta or any Vedanta theory. It's not like there's some degrees of consciousness in everything. In fact, what's really nicely pointed out here is that you have to have, the material has to have some other factor which is grounded in the ultimate consciousness, but it's a factor that differentiates from being sentient and insentient. So a little bit of difference between sentience and consciousness, but at least here we can see this thing. So they say that Atmabodha, which is another Advaita Vedantic text traditionally attributed to Shankara, anticipates the question and answers that although all-pervading Atman does not shine in everything, it is manifest only in the buddhi, like a reflection in clear water on a stainless mirror. Yes, this is a very important point I also learned by studying Atmabodha with V.N. Jha a couple of years ago. Finally, they say, as Shankara writes in Kena Upanishad 2.4, Vakyabhasha, all the various thoughts, pratyaha, arising in the buddhi, which we may say are nothing but the modifications of the buddhi, are illumined by the immaterial self, which is of the nature of pure consciousness. It can therefore be said that illumination by the immaterial consciousness can explain the subjective or phenomenal quality of one's conscious states. That's a very key idea. While the material buddhi furnishes the physical base required for them to participate in the causal processes. The conception of a special material substance capable of reflecting the immaterial consciousness thus enables Shankara to bridge the gap between immaterial consciousness and the material world. As a result, Shankara's theory is able to explain mental causation without violating the thesis of completeness of physics and account for the subject character of consciousness states as well. So I'm actually very in favor of this approach that these authors have taken. I find it very interesting. And in fact, I'm currently working on trying to see how this version of cosmopsychism squares with the new Goff theory of strongly emergent subjects and weakly emergent properties, and see what is the relationship between those two. But it's important to recognize that in the space of using Shankara, Al-Bahari and these authors have something in common, but they also have something that's different going on. And that's important that they're paying attention to subtle differences. I think there are some other people who've also written on this. Dmitry Shevchenko, I think also at Ashoka has some stuff on also on thinking about post-Shankaran theories and how they relate. So now back to my thing. So I don't think Vedanta was interested in the hard problem of consciousness. And I think that actually the second set of authors is more clearly able to point out that we can bend the theory in a way to make it apply without saying that that's what was going on. And Al-Bahari is a little bit less sensitive to that point, but I think she's aware of it. So we can't infer from the structural similarity between analytic cosmopsychism and varieties of Vedanta cosmopsychism. The latter always has the features relevant for addressing the hard problem. In my view, neither Shankara nor Ramanuja were interested in the hard problem of the consciousness. Nevertheless, I will argue for two positions. Shankara's theory does not fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, although as the latter authors, I think, are aware of, we can bend it to do so as part of fusion philosophy, and then we can question What's the value of that kind of fusion? Ramanuja's theory does fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, but then we must accept a theistic solution to the hard problem, and I think that's fine. But also, I think Ramanuja, even though he fits the frame, that doesn't mean he's going for that kind of thing. And my own work has been on defending Ramanuja as fitting the frame. I have like a whole paper dedicated to that. So Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is basically categorically inappropriate to solve the hard problem of consciousness. Why? In Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, fundamental consciousness lacks qualities. It's nirguna, lacks intentionality. There's no subject-object dichotomy. And 3, there are no real subjects of experience, right? They're illusions. The hard problem is focused on the explanation of qualia in subjective experience that is intentional, subjective, and for subjects of experience that are real. So Advaita needs to show how intentionality and qualities arise for subjects of experience and why intentionality and qualities arise for subjects of experience. And I think Advaita does have something to say about that. I'm not going to say in this talk whether I think those are very coherent answers, but I definitely think they have something to say about it. So maybe we can look to and make an analogy between some analytic theories and Shankara's view to get some help from analytic philosophy. So pan-qualityism is a view in analytic philosophy, whereas panpsychists think that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. Pan-protopsychists think that proto-consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. The properties that characterize conscious experience are commonly referred to as phenomenal properties, and hence the properties involved in proto-consciousness are referred to as proto-phenomenal properties. Pan-qualityism is the view that proto-phenomenal properties are unexperienced qualities. So there are these qualities that are proto-phenomenal, but they're unexperienced. They don't have a subject. Whereas panpsychism hold that the world is filled with experienced qualities, those phenomenal qualities involved in seeing color or feeling pain, pan-qualityists believe that such qualities are only contingently experienced, and that in basic matter they exist on it. So that looks like it's cutting the subject-object dichotomy, but now if we go carefully to the argument, I don't think it works. Pan-qualityism requires that phenomenal consciousness is fundamental, and 2, that there are genuine qualities at the fundamental level that exist unexperienced. Advaita Vedanta maintains that pure consciousness at the fundamental level exists unexperienced by anyone, and fundamental consciousness is without qualities. So Advaita Vedanta captures 1 of pan-quality, but it fails to capture 2, because again, it's nirguna. So the illumination of the light is an illumination of a light with a pure quality. It's not the illumination of all, it's not the capturing of all the qualities that are already there. Pan-qualityism is positing the qualities at the fundamental level. It's not positing that it's illumination alone that gets these things off the ground. So there's something tricky that has to be done to get that to work. I don't see it working out. And then Angela Mendelovecki has defended a view known as phenomenal intentionality. And her view is that from pure phenomenology, we can generate intentionality. Now, this might be thought to help Shankara's Advaita because, again, we can talk about witness consciousness, as Al-Bahari pointed out, as having this pure phenomenal character, although I claim I don't really understand how that is going on there, because if she's just talking about illumination, it's the light analogy again. And so then we can argue that maybe if the analytic movement of pure phenomenology can generate intentionality, then we can go pure witnessing consciousness has this phenomenology, phenomenal character, and that's sufficient to generate it. That's the point of Angela Mendelovecki's book in analytic philosophy. However, it cannot, because pure consciousness at best has only bliss as a quality, which again can be thought to be contradictory. How is it Shankara is saying that it's nirguna and then it has a quality of bliss, ananda? I actually have an argument about how he can defend that view, but clearly it's kind of a tension. In order to create the rich palette of conscious experience, we need a plethora of phenomenal qualities that can serve as the basis for intentionality. The overall approach can work in analytic philosophy, but I don't think it can work for Shankara's Advaita because, again, we have the nirguna problem. So we should now say that there are good things that actually Advaita does. We don't want to say that what's going on here is bad all the way down because it's not. So it does answer the modal coherence question. It holds that individual subjects are illusory, but that non-dual pure consciousness is real. It answers the mechanical generation question. It holds that ignorance is what generates illusory subjects and their experience. I'm not clear on whether it answers the metaphysical explanation question. It does not say why ignorance covers pure consciousness. I think when you look at people like Sri Aurobindo and his involution theory that Swami Medhananda has defended about how he answers the decombination problem or the subject individuation problem, we get a better picture of why it is the case that something is done. I don't know in what sense Shankara can say a story of why we get decombination or subject individuation. And I don't think the authors of the paper from the Indian authors actually address that issue as much. They're more concerned with the first two, I think. All of this just acknowledges where it gives and might not give answers, but not whether these answers are satisfying. I don't think Shankara's answers are satisfying here, but that's because I have more realist commitments that favor other theories. So finally, my view would be that the hard problem is about intentional consciousness, consciousness that is directed, as Brentano says, all consciousness is consciousness of something. Advaita Vedanta holds that only consciousness that is real is non-dual consciousness, where there is no subject or object and no qualitative phenomenal or intentional structure. And by that, I mean it doesn't have the intentional structure that is defined by the subject-object dichotomy. There could be another notion of intentional structure. I'm just not clear what that could possibly be. And also, I'm reflecting the fact that after giving various accounts of Shankara to various analytic philosophers over a decade, that many of them also find it very hard to understand what this is, almost uniformly. It's a technical question that requires some work. So Shankara's Advaita account of a real consciousness does not apply to the hard problem, really. There are similarities between what he's doing, and we can bend it, but I don't really think it does. Strangely and interestingly, though, his view seems to be completely consistent with a dissolution to the problem that is offered by Keith Frankish, known as illusionism about consciousness. So in my view, actually, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is actually a valuable companion to Keith Frankish's view. In Advaita Vedanta, only that which is permanent or beyond time is fundamental. In Advaita Vedanta, only that which is fundamental is real. So in Advaita Vedanta, only that which is permanent or beyond time is real. Conscious states of macro subjects are not permanent in time. Ownerless, subjectless, non-dual consciousness is permanent in or beyond time. So non-dual consciousness is fundamental. Dual consciousness is not fundamental. So conscious states of macro subjects are a mere illusion. This seems to me the Shankaran argument for illusionism about subject level consciousness. And that's precisely the position that Frankish argues for, but he doesn't do through this argument. So there's a deep connection there. Okay, now going on to someone who I think does work. So really quickly, in Ramanuja, there's a distinction between Brahman, pure consciousness without attributes, nirguna, and Brahman, pure consciousness with attributes, saguna. Shankara only accepts Brahman, pure consciousness without as being real. Any attributes of Brahman are in appearance only. Ramanuja accepts both. So I already think Ramanuja is closer. In Ramanuja, the Supreme Person is constituted by consciousness and has consciousness. Consciousness without a self is impossible. In Shankara's consciousness without a self is possible, since Brahman is pure consciousness, that makes it harder. I think Ramanuja agrees with Brentano that all consciousness is consciousness of something by a subject of consciousness. Shankara seems to strongly disagree with Brentano, and that's the point of the project of making sense of pure witness consciousness. Ramanuja's theory, in classical Indian metaphysics, there's a distinction between a mode and the mode possessor. For example, the color of a rose and the rose that possesses the color. In Ramanuja, the kind of metaphysical dependence between a mode and its possessor is used to hold that the Supreme Person is strictly distinct from each conscious finite self and all non-conscious matter, even though they are inseparable from the Supreme Person. Shankara holds that Brahman is strictly identical to each finite self, which then, as a result, leads to the conclusion that each finite self is identical to each other, which some people could think is a problem. Shankara's use of strict identity, that's what I just said, leads to the view that all of us are ultimately identical to each other and to Brahman, which can lead to a problem depending on what you think about the metaphysics there. Ramanuja's theory, again, Ramanuja disagrees with Shankara over how the criterion for real should be used. For Shankara, everything that passes in time is unreal/illusory. Impermanence is the mark of unreality. For Ramanuja, impermanence does not entail unreality. For example, both material bodies and conscious finite selves are temporally bound and impermanent, qua material bodies and finite selves, yet they are and inhabit a different kind of reality than what the Supreme Person inhabits. Ramanuja accepts that there are different ways of being real that do not show that something is less real, but rather only real in a different way. I think there are different interpretations of Ramanuja and Shankara on this point. We can discuss it in Q&A. Upshot, Ramanuja, unlike Shankara, holds that intentional structure and qualities are fundamental and real. The realism aspect of Ramanuja's view makes his view applicable to solving the hard problem of consciousness. Shankara's view is at best a dissolution via the illusionism strategy of the decombination problem that requires still an answer to the subject individuation question. And so in that sense, I think some of the properties that Ramanuja has fit the frame of the hard problem of consciousness clearly better than Shankara in my view. But I would back off by saying that was what Ramanuja was all about. It's rather that if you accept his theism and you think then you can get an answer to the modal coherence, the modal generation, and the metaphysical explanation, this view is coming closer into giving a solution as opposed to a dissolution to the hard problem of consciousness. Okay. But this is all a way of saying that we shouldn't be talking about this maybe, or we should add to the discussion the thing that Indian philosophers really were talking about. Indian philosophers were interested in the hard problem of the self. That's the name I give it. How is the self related to fundamental reality, which is consciousness? I think many Indian schools and thinkers go in for this kind of question and frame, not only Vedanta, but Kashmiri Shaivism, various schools of Buddhism, maybe Yogacara, I'm unclear about that. Sri Ramakrishna for sure, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo all seem to be people who go in for this. Many Indian philosophers debated this by considering illusionism and realism about the self in relationship to consciousness as fundamental reality. The leading question is, which illusion, if any, should we accept in a unified theory of self and consciousness in relation to fundamental reality? And following David Chalmers, who has been a big influence in my philosophical career, I created my own list of options, which I call the asymmetric positions and the symmetric positions. So my view would be that just as his argument leads to 6 positions we can consider, my question leads to 4 questions we consider, which I think already are explored in Indian philosophy. Type S illusionism is illusionism about the self and realism about consciousness. I think that's pretty much an Advaita position. I think there's type C illusionism, where there's realism about the self and illusionism about consciousness. I think there's a version of thinking about Charvaka, which would make it the case that it fits in that camp. Then there's type D illusionism, illusionism about the self and illusionism about consciousness. Maybe Yogacara fits, I'm not sure yet, but I think some school of Buddhism is going to fit in this camp because Jay Garfield has argued both for illusionism about the self and illusionism about consciousness in his work on Buddhism. So I know some Buddhism school fits. I'm just not sure that Yogacara is the right one. And then obviously I think type R realism, which is the one I go in for, realism about the self and realism about consciousness, is a view found in Ramanuja and in Vishishta Advaita. So I think this is a framework that we can adopt, and then we can say, what does analytic philosophy and phenomenology have to say about this problematic in Indian philosophy? Instead of saying, oh, there's a problematic in Indian philosophy, in analytic philosophy, let's bend all of our theories to sort of fit this thing that we were never really discussing. Let's try to draw people into the thing that clearly we were discussing, because as we see in analytic philosophy, there's been a progression to include discussions of the self in relationship to consciousness to generate problems and theories now. But that was all along what was going on in classical Indian philosophy. We were always thinking about this because the project of a darshan is to give a unified account across many different parameters, not to piecemeal give a theory of consciousness and the self. So someone like Derek Parfit gives a big theory of the self, but no theory of consciousness. And David Chalmers gives a big theory of consciousness, no theory of the self. Galen Strawson gives a theory of the self and the theory of consciousness, but he doesn't always connect them together. And so the question is, in Indian philosophy, this was never really going on. I think they don't piecemeal cut things apart and separate them in that analytic way. They try to have a unified account. And I think this framework, which is superior, I've defended for at least 3 or 4 papers, I think clearly should draw people to the conversation in Indian philosophy. So the Indian concern with the hard problem of the self can draw theories of the self into conversation with theories of consciousness and fundamental reality. We need not accept the frame of the hard problem of consciousness, which rests on Chalmers' zombie argument, which I think is completely foreign to Indian philosophy, where the options are generated only in relation to rejecting the steps in an argument that does not mention the self at all and has not used it. And that's not a way of saying that Dave's work is unvaluable. In fact, I find myself spending a lot of time working on that problem. But I don't think that we should think this is the main problem only that we should be focusing on. Rather, we should push for the hard problem of the self into the space and draw other traditions towards us so that we're not always like working in their framework. The hard problem itself serves as an attractive frame for debating the self, consciousness, and fundamental reality that draws other traditions to Indian philosophical problems. So sorry for the long talk. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your really fascinating talk. What we'll do now is we'll move into a question and answer period. And so I think the first question that we have is from Ritu Barnaroy. And so I will unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself and then go ahead and ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you, Professor Vaidya, for this insightful talk. And I just, because you have swiped the terms self and subject of experience quite a few times, and I somehow feel that the term subject of experience disclose an aspect of the self, and the notion of self is a bit broader than the subject of experience. Though the journey to find self starts with the subject or experiencing subject. So my question is whether is it appropriate to swipe both of the term self and subject of experience?
No, I don't really think so. I think that actually it's just being sloppy right now in order to get some movement in the space, because I think the tenor of my talk is that there are problems by grammatical categories and problems by semantics in the language in which we're speaking. So it's hard sometimes to think about what would be the Sanskrit term for talking about a self that isn't also a soul. There's a problem thinking about what the Sanskrit term would be for thinking about a subject of experience that would match up with what's going on in the discussion and the analytics. So we need two things here to solve this problem. One, we need some very fine-grained analysis of what's going on in the English and the Sanskrit so we can figure out about the semantic range. So Chit has such a wide semantic range that sometimes it's very hard to locate it and pin it down to the right. Chaitanya has this problem. I think in a lot of ways, Atman, Jiva, and all I'm looking for is for some clarity. And as you point out, the problem already occurs in English. So for some people like Galen Strawson who have these very intricate accounts of subjectivity, subjective experience, and self, there are a lot of things going on. So we know, for example, with some notions of the self has the property of being persistent over time and a controller, right? And having endurance. But we know that in a Buddhist, when they argue for no self, they don't think that it has a controller, persistence in time, and this controlling activity. But again, sometimes when people understand Buddhism, they think that the no self theory means that there is nothing there at all. Like some people would think that there's not, but that doesn't have to be. There's a minimal notion of the self that people like Matthew Mackenzie have defended. And so there are different ways of going. So you're right. We should be clear about that. Does it really affect any of the arguments I gave today? I'm not sure, but I definitely would say that grammatical and semantic precision, which I think is something that happens in Acharya Staneshwar's book, Awareness Only in Indian, like paying attention to those things is kind of where we need to go. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I get my answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. Next, I'd invite Professor Bernacki to unmute and ask your question. Or I can ask it for her. Is it the case that much of the non-dual Kashmiri Shaiva critique of Shankara does indeed hinge entirely on the problem of intentionality, intrinsic to perspective? And, by the way, integrated information theory achieves this as well with the idea of phi. This is analogous to the demarcation between Prakash and Vimarsha. The Buddhi itself doesn't convincingly have anything to sustain consciousness.
Well, I mean, surely Lorelei has a better understanding of what's going on in Kashmiri Shaivism, but insofar as I read her book and wrote a book review of it, I'll try to answer it carefully. I would say that, so one thing I would say first with the middle part of the question is, it's not clear to me that integrated information theory is a theory of phenomenal consciousness. I don't see why it can't be a theory of access consciousness. I know that that's probably not what they want. I think they probably think that global workspace theory is a theory of access consciousness and integrated information theory, given its notion of the axioms of this information in terms of phenomenal experience, is about phenomenal consciousness. However, I've never really been completely convinced about how that theory has to be understood that way, as opposed to that they want it to be. I think it's also important that they have included the notion of subjectivity more and more into their view. And I do see that there is a relationship between that kind of version and Lorelei's own understanding of what's going on in Kashmiri Shaivism. I do think Kashmiri Shaivism has a one-up on Shankara. I think many theories have a one-up on Shankara. I think that's part of what goes on with Sri Aurobindo's view and also Swami Vivekananda. So I do think that there are other views in Indian philosophy that are doing better. I personally like Ramanuja, but some people think that maybe I'm just over addicted to the realism component and that there's other ways to go, especially someone who likes Swami Vivekananda. I do have something to say about the Prakasha and the Vimarsha thing, which I think is very interesting in your book. I definitely think that you have done some really interesting work to show how Prakasha and Vimarsha come together. But as I wrote in my book review, I will also talk about this. I'm not sure how a factoring theory then comes together to give us the subject level answer to the hard problem of consciousness. And so that's just a kind of, I mean, between me and Lorelei, she'll understand because of what I'm referring to in her book. But I understood you to be giving a factoring theory, saying that within the way in which we think about these two things, Prakasha and Vimarsha, and Prakasha, as I understand, is light, and Vimarsha is a subjective awareness part, the intentionality part. I think that's right. It does have a one-up on Shankara in that way. But again, when you factor things A and B, in general, it seems like you have to put A and B back together. I mean, maybe you did give an account of how they come together and what's going on. And you also showed clearly how they're not like Spinoza's distinctions between thought and extension. You showed very clearly in your book how this sort of dual aspect monism with a cosmopsychism center is different from the Bertrand Russell type of view and the Pauli Young view. So I think you very nicely laid out the analytical framework of it. My only question to you was about how we might think about factoring theories, bringing things together, because at the subject level, we think about what's known as the unity of consciousness, that the unity of consciousness would require that these factoring elements in normal phenomenal states would be put together. So I think, I mean, I would definitely say that yes, what you did in Abhinavagupta in that book definitely goes further than, and I think that's correct. So again, I'm not criticizing all the views out there in Indian philosophy that try to solve the hard problem of consciousness. I'm questioning whether or not we're getting the details right as opposed to structural similarity. So you're right. There's a structural similarity between certain forms of what Abhinavagupta is saying and various theories like Pauli Young and Bertrand Russell or even Spinoza, and there's differences, and you're very careful to march those out, but then there still might be questions about how it answers the basic hard problem as opposed to giving a dissolution in some way. And I think that is good. So I can't hear you, but if you can unmute, I'd be happy to talk more about the issue. And I also think you're right that there's a theological aspect to Abhinavagupta that's like what we find in Ramanuja. I think Ravi, she can't unmute herself because
Yeah, so I've been clicking S to unmute, but if you're not able to, maybe Acharya-ji, you can make her a co-host, and then that makes it much easier to unmute oneself.
So we have more questions.
Yeah.
If time allows, we'll get back to Lorelei, but I'll make her a co-host in the meanwhile.
Okay, perfect. So I think our next question was from R.K. Cole. So I'll unmute you and have you ask your question.
I think we're having an unmuting problem. Can you unmute?
So Lorelai, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now, correct?
Ask to unmute. Okay. I've clicked
Oh.
ask to unmute, but then
Yeah. Rian, I think you have a question as well.
Can anyone unmute?
Hello.
Someone can. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for the letter, teacher Anand Vaidya. And I would like to ask you what you think about Wolfgang Fasching's remarks about the qualitative or intentional character that is presupposed on the traditional formulation of the hard problem is actually mistaken, since it's objectual mode. And he says that it's the presence or luminosity aspect that it needs to be addressed. That's precisely what Advaita Vedanta seeks to address.
Yeah, I know. So I think William actually, I was there at the conference when he presented this paper. It was in China, I believe, where he presented this paper. I mean, I generally agree with the idea of trying to talk about supporting Advaita Vedanta in terms of getting ways of reformulating the problem so that it matches what Advaita Vedanta is doing. So you can bend it in both ways. You can bend Shankara with interpretations of his work afterwards or going to different texts to fit in with the hard problem, or you can argue against what the hard problem of consciousness is as a way of getting into how Advaita Vedanta addresses it because the problem is misformulated. But in both cases, can you tell me why you find that to be superior to my strategy of saying, well, there was another question called the hard problem of the self that Shankara was clearly interested in, and why can't we ask analytic philosophers to engage this problem, given that they're accidentally stumbling into it very clearly now in the space of cosmopsychism? And Dave, in his second TED talk, actually talked about the movement from the hard problem to taking seriously the idea that consciousness in some sense is fundamental, which he didn't side with the cosmopsychist picture versus the micropsychist picture, but he sided with the fundamentality thesis. So yeah, I can agree with William. I can agree that we can argue, but again, that sounds like what we're doing is we're picking at the analytic problem to then find a way for Shankara to fit an answer that he does give, or what we're doing is we're leaving the problem as it is and bending Shankara in a way to sort of make other aspects of his view fit what the hard problem, how to answer the hard problem. Can you explain to me what would be wrong with taking my approach?
No, I don't say that it's actually wrong. I was just with a curiosity to know what you think about, because
I think
I
that's
have
fine. I have no
I have
reason. I have no
I have
reason.
I have a little intuition that actually that what is problematic, what's the hard problem seeks to address is the problematic that is not actually found in the qualitative experience, and in the sense that when I have a qualia, for example, I don't think that's problematic, the qualitative aspect, because it's something that I can represent. It's something that is not have the ineffable character that is that seeks to be addressed when we think that it's actually a hard problem. I think I don't have some exact position on it, but I have a little intuition that what is problematic when we think about this problem, it's not the actual sensations or the qualitative aspects behind it, but it's something more ineffable, non-objectual, that it does not address by mathematical or scientific language. And I think that it's something kind of this way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so my final responses would be, again, there are many papers written on the hard problem of consciousness, the harder problem of consciousness, papers of saying there is no hard problem of consciousness, Anil Seth's work on the real problem of consciousness. I don't think there's anything wrong with that research. It's perfectly fine. So if William and you think that, hey, we can actually show that the hard problem of consciousness is about illumination, and that ties in with the prakasha element or what's going on with maybe some of the pure witness consciousness, and maybe even with Karen Pop O'Brien's paper on the hard problem of pure consciousness. I think that's fine. I just think we're bending Indian philosophy, or in some ways looking at the hard problem in order to sort of shoehorn it in. I don't see why we can't, as Indian philosophers who like Indian philosophy, say we have this really cool, direct, clear problem which all of us were addressing. What do your traditions have to say about this problem? Why can't we drive the traffic towards our own tradition and see the importance of that as having a valuable problem, instead of saying that unless we can address this problem that was created by people in analytic philosophy, like what we're doing is not valuable. That's kind of where I see the tension. That's why for 4 years I've defended this problem called the problem of the self, in terms of this question, which if illusion, if any, should I accept? Which I think a lot of people can go in for, because there's a lot of discussion about illusions of the self, illusions of consciousness in multiple traditions. Thomas Metzinger has a lot of work in his neuroscientific theory of the self. There's a lot of stuff in this in Keith Frankich's work and Jay Garfield. There's lots of people. I think we can bring all of that together, and we can still talk about aspects of the pure consciousness and the luminosity thing. So your luminosity question will still fit in my frame, because luminosity is a way of thinking about one aspect of the hard problem of the self. So I guess I don't see anything wrong with William Fashing's. I was there. I don't think anything wrong with him trying to say the hard problem consciousness should be really understood in terms of the illumination property instead of the qualitative character. But given the way the analytic discussion has proceeded, it seems to me like pan-qualityism and phenomenal intentionality are ways that are dealing, in some sense. Maybe phenomenal intentionality fits with this William Fashing sort of luminosity sort of point about the hard problem, and that maybe could be made to work. I didn't say it couldn't. I just didn't see how exactly it would work out. But at least there are these aspects about nirguna and saguna, which I think are somewhat problematic in some senses for Shankara. That's the most I can say. Thank you for your question.
Thanks so
Thanks
much.
for the answer.
So we have a question from Rakesh Goel, and I'm going to read it. Does not the Rig Veda in the Nasadiya Sukta state that the primal seed of generation is intentionality? Also, is there a subtle different approach to the heart problem that is not unification-based, but instead on the premise of the reduction of all abhasa and experiences to the irreducible minimum, which is deemed to be identical for all experiences and ultimately to the universal consciousness? This does not need any special material or unification, but instead identity.
Okay. Yeah, so first part, I don't know what the Rig Veda says, so I'm not going to comment on what the Rig Veda says at that specific location, because I have not read the Rig Veda at that specific location. So I'll take your word for it. But in general, if the fundamental base is intentionality, then again, what we have to talk about is this relationship of objectless intentionality, because that's what's going on in Shankara, and that was what I was talking about, which again, I think some people find to be difficult to understand. Brentano did say consciousness is consciousness always of something, and that's analytic of the concept of consciousness, and he gave a kind of imaginative variation argument about this to talk about why he thought that was true. So of course, we can disagree, but this is a fundamental disagreement that would make it the case, I think, that maybe Shankara's theory doesn't fit the frame. Okay, so yes, intentionality can be the base. That would also invert the phenomenal intentionality project that Angela has, because that's from phenomenology to intentionality, and this is from intentionality to, I guess, phenomenology. But again, when we go from intentionality to phenomenology, it could then make sense to talk about the illumination theory. But again, the illumination theory doesn't populate the quality aspect. It populates, I don't know, and this is where the light analogy is really bad. I mean, it lights it up for us in one sense. I mean, what does that do? I mean, is the lighting up the raw field? I mean, so is the raw field in the intentional relation, and then the light just does what? What does the light do then? In fact, the light, it makes it more mysterious. Like, what is the light for? If intentionality is already there and the raw field doesn't come from the light. So here's the dilemma I see. Either the raw field is in the intentionality, in which case the light seems irrelevant. Maybe blindside cases are like that. That's where the subject has access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness, because they don't see the actual object they're interacting with. So either it's the raw field's in the intentionality, or it's not. If the raw field is not in the intentionality and it's in the phenomenology, then how does the light that attaches to the intentionality provide the plurality? Because light is like a single, the light analogy is bad because the light is a single thing. How is it going to produce the variation of quality between smell, touch, and hearing? That is what we're trying to explain at the subject level. Now, maybe there is an explanation, and that's a wonderful project, but off the bat of it, I can just give a dilemma right away. Either it's in the intentionality in case the light doesn't matter at all because all it does is light it up, or it's not in the intentionality, it's in the light, in which case, how does the light produce the plurality? That would, I would think, to be the fundamental issue for this approach. Thank you very much for the question.
And if it helps you gloss it any further, the sukta that they're talking about, the Nasadya, is the one of, in the beginning, there was neither nothing nor not-nothing, and then, it was breathing on its own, and then, gosh, desire arose. And so it's this idea of creation emerging out of desire. And I guess that's not fundamentally so different from some of the Shaiva ideas of, there being Shakti related to desire. So I don't know if that helps you.
It does help. It does help. But again, so the generative property here of desire having an intentional relation and then using a Shakti style metaphysics instead of like an atomistic metaphysics is relevant here. But again, I think the dilemma still persists because we don't understand how the desiring, if it's a purely intentional, non-phenomenal relation, is going to produce the qualitative difference that we need. So that's the thing. What does the light do? And if the light does something, how does it do it? So we still have that question about that. So, I mean, and again, that there might be better answers to this in Kashmiri Shaivism than other traditions, I think is actually exactly why the development of Indian philosophical thought is so interesting, because there's so many excellent arguments across the different periods that we should be supporting and developing for a wider audience. Yes, I agree with that.
And I think we have a few more questions. Firas, are you able to ask your question?
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. I mean, that was really, really amazing. I really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate the differentiation you've made from self and consciousness, because I think there's a lot of confusion between these two things, and it ends up with people kind of talking past each other. But I guess my question to you is would it be even more useful to kind of differentiate even more? Because it seems that some people, when they speak of self, they're speaking more of like a personal identity, I am so-and-so from so-and-so place. Whilst other people might speak of self, it seems to me that you're defining self as just intentionality and phenomenal consciousness.
No, that's not correct.
Or do you mean personal identity?
No, continue. Your question is very good, but I am not defining it that way.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, how do you differentiate between the different types of self, and what exactly is your definition of self?
Good. So I follow a couple of philosophers who have noted, I think actually I read it in Sean Gallagher's work and maybe in Galen Strawson, that there are in English at least 17 different notions of the self that are at play. 17. I think there are much more actually, but part of my talk was intentionally to leave it undefined, because I think part of the project is that you define a certain notion, like a Buddhist notion of no self. This is going to be very hard for some people to hear, is for me not a theory of no self. It's a theory of no permanent self in time. The thing that the Buddhists are arguing against is that there is some persistent, enduring thing over time, and that there is a thing that has this control aspect of. And so they're negating specific properties that are attributed by various Hindu traditions to the notion of a self, but they are not arguing against other notions of the self that could be on the table. So when someone tries to give an answer to the hard problem of the self, I think it's incumbent upon them to define what notion of the self it is that they're going in for and what they think it has in relationship to fundamental consciousness. So people who define self as a soul that's immaterial, such as jiva or something, are very different from people who define the self as a narrative construction that requires an authorial subject that persists over time, such as to be able to narrate the story that is the self that's growing and evolving over time. But narrative constructions are very different than soul constructions of the self. But the idea is that self has a controlling aspect on theories of integrating consciousness with them. And so my view is that insofar as Indian philosophy was interested in this idea of talking about the self in relationship to consciousness as fundamental reality, there is a way of putting these two together. Of course, I agree 100%. You got to define the self, but you got to define consciousness also. So I think that makes my sort of project and frame wider in a sense that's important. I personally have defended the view that the self is not permanent in time and that the self is impermanent in time, but that I have argued that various Buddhist philosophers engage in a fallacious inference that I don't understand. So from the fact that something is not permanent in time, we can say that it's impermanent in time, but from its impermanence, we cannot infer that it has no temporal duration. So my understanding is Dharmakirti gives an argument for which the arising of a moment is continuous with its dissension as a moment. And so there is no moment. It's the momentariness inference, the Nyayaka's critique. And the momentary inference denies that there is this moment where the self can persist through. I think that's a completely incoherent argument, but obviously, because I'm a Nyayaka, people are going to say you're biased. But I don't think that the momentary inference makes sense. And in addition, I think it's absolutely clear that there has to be at least a self that persists for a durational moment, even if the duration is very thin. It can't be zero. But some scholars think that Dharmakirti is not actually committed to the momentariness thing. But I think any Buddhist theory that entails that no self requires that there is no self, even for a fleeting moment, because it's a momentary in the sense of being non-durational, doesn't make sense to me analytically, especially if you have an authorial account, a narrative theory of the self, which is an illusory type of theory of the self. Authoring the self requires that there's something there to do the authoring, and that thing has to exist for some moment in time to do some authoring, such as that at the next causal moment, a self that is an author that's different from the self at the prior moment could continue authoring or disagree with the authorship. So the fact that there's causal continuity over time is consistent with the Buddhist theory that there are only these causal things. But what they also want to sometimes deny is that at any moment, there is nothing there in between. And that has to do with the theory of causation that they have. And I think I just disagree with that theory. So that's my sort of view. Thank you very much for your question.
And just to pick up on some of the questions that have been in the chat, would you be able then to talk a little bit about, we've brought up Kashmiri Shaiva, right? And Utpaladeva talks, a lot about synthesis. So the function of this prakash isn't strictly inert, right? There is an element of, looking or desire or, projection. So it's far more active. And then the idea is that, well, prakasha you can't see directly, but vimarsha is how you see things. You see things through the reflection. So in Tantra Loka, there's the idea of like, well, even if you can't see the entire tree, just by looking at it, you can't taste it, but there's some element of it that is graspable, right? So the question then is, synthesis seems to be the very important argument against momentariness,
Yes,
or the Kashmiri Shaivas. And so does that, because I was looking at kind of your question about, well, how things break down and how things sort of reaggregate. And the interesting, I guess, question from the Kashmiri Shaiva perspective is that synthesis itself, the capacity of individuals to synthesize, and then the process of synthesizing across individuals to the universal, which is Shiva, is itself the proof of the prakasha. So I'm wondering if that fits into your frame or if there's something...
So I'm aware of the synthesis argument. I don't think it's the same one, but in general, I think that I touch what I saw from Gautama Aksapada and the Nyaya Sutras is one of the first important moments of a rejection of the Buddhist position by talking about cross-modal integration. Arindam Chakrabarti has done a lot of work to try and make sense of this argument. Janardhan Ganeri has also written on this, and I myself am working on it now. I think synthesis-style arguments are good. Now, what you pointed to is an interesting complication that is important in Kashmiri Shaivism that can make the synthesis argument more interesting, and that's because we've divided prakasha and vimarsha in a way that can allow for an interesting synthesis. And again, my position here, I think you'll see, is consistent with what I've been saying. This is the kind of work that I think is very important that we can do in Indian philosophy, but I don't see particularly that it needs to be addressed to answering the hard problem of consciousness. I think it needs to be addressed towards the frame that I think it was already addressing towards. So So we know that, I mean, at least from what I remember, we know that Kashmiri Shaivism definitely tries to reject aspects of what Dharmakirti and certain Buddhists are saying. And so they are pushing back on the momentariness sort of. So they have an interesting way of developing. I don't know in my own understanding of Kashmiri Shaivism. I basically know Abhinavagupta to a very small degree, mostly through Lorelei and Staneshwar's work, but not as much about Utpaladeva. But I have a friend working on it. Amit is working on Utpaladeva right now. I think that the issue for me is that I tend to lean heavily towards the really strong realist traditions of Ramanuja and Nyaya. So Navya Nyaya and Nyaya are based. I like to promote the interesting discussion in Indian philosophy of realism because I think most people associate outside of India Indian philosophy with some form of anti-realism of various kinds. And I think these two traditions at least are very good at giving realist sort of answers. So I tend to sort of work in those areas. So I'd have less to say in a scholarly way about this. But I would say from what I do know that these are interesting debates that we can learn about by seeing how, for example, they're rejecting Dharmakirti's arguments or they're saying that synthesis plays a role. I see synthesis as initially in the I touched what I saw argument about cross-modal synchronic integration over time. That's where I see it.
Okay, and I think we have one question from Krishna Swami, and he asks, can't there be consciousness that is hypothetical, neither real nor illusory, in the sense that consciousness or the nature of the conscious states across dualist and non-dualist accounts helps you make transitions which affirm the dualist or non-dualist view of consciousness you have? That way, you don't have to commit to an ontology of consciousness. This is similar to Anil Gupta's views.
Yeah, let me see. Can there be hypothetical states of consciousness which are neither illusory or real? I mean, I guess initially I would ask like, is the state of consciousness conditionalized, or are we saying that consciousness is posited hypothetically? Like, yeah, I don't know what is it hypothetical consciousness, or is it consciousness that is hypothetical, whose content is hypothetical? So I ask Krishna Swami which one it is. So consciousness, if X, then G, or consciousness is hypothetically positive, whether you're conscious or not, it's hypothetically positive. There's two notions of the notion of hypothetical consciousness. One is that the content of the consciousness, what it's about, is hypothetically taken, if X, then G, or the consciousness itself is hypothetical. I don't know which one. I think to be within Anil Gupta, it's the second one, that if X, then G. But I don't know. In general, I would think that there's no reason why you can't have the second one, that a state of consciousness is hypothetical. If something exists, then it's G. And maybe that does support a way of thinking about pure consciousness by thinking about hypothetical consciousness. I'm not exactly sure, but I don't see a problem with that off the bat. I could see that that could be made to work.
Okay. So I think we've reached.
Oh wait, there's what? Can I answer responsibly? Lorelei wrote up here in her thing that we didn't see. What is the difference between Chit and Vimarsha? So I think Staneshwar and Lorelei can correct my Sanskrit more, but in talking to Sanskrit scholars, I thought the semantic range of Chit was much wider than that of Vimarsha. Chit can be translated in a number of ways into English. I was talking to Parimal Patil at Harvard about the specific question, and he said it's okay in various cases and contexts to say that Chit is capturing a notion of consciousness, but it's much wider in a lot of other contexts. I took Vimarsha to have a much narrower semantic range in relationship to the kind of variants we want in English than Chit, but obviously Acharya would know much better than me if I'm right about that. But I did consult with Sanskrit scholars about the translation of Chit and Chaitanya. I think they have a wider range than Vimarsha, from my understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Acharya-ji. Do you want to take us away?
I think we should wrap up. And thank you, Anand. You have always inspired and supported me and Vimarsha. Thank you, my sister Lorelai. And thank you, Professor Janardhan Ganeri. Thank you, Professor Jeff Aston. Thank you, everybody. I agree, Anand, when assessing Shankara's model in engaging the hard problem. Partly in my works, I have been unwilling even to engage these issues when I wrote those books.
I know. And actually, I just want to say something. It was your hesitation 5 years ago. You told me, I asked you, I remember I said, what do you think about this? And you said, I hesitated in my book and I hesitate now. And your hesitation is what led me to then think about it. I said, then I'll go think about why he's hesitating, because he's much smarter about the Sanskrit than I am. So he must be hesitating for a very good reason. Then I spoke to my friend in Kerala, and she said she hesitated for the same reason. So then I was like, I got to work on this. That's exactly why I did it.
After 12 years of hesitation, if I must say one sentence on this topic, let's forget about what Shankara thinks of consciousness as the absolute reality. Let's just drop that. And what Shankara says in the beginning of the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, Pratyaya Gocharayoho, Vishaya Vishayinoho, Tamaha Prakashavad Viruddha Svabhayoho, etc. So he starts from the sheer dichotomy of subject and object. Shankara is willing to forget his own absolute philosophy in order to address the phenomenal problem. And for that, his idea is the concept of abhasa, and how many ways we can use, apply, interpret this category. And then there are 3 other categories. By the way, this abhasa comes alongside the pratibimba, and then at the same time, we'll have to also deal with the avacheda. Those are 3 models within Advaita. They all appear everything the same for outsiders, but for the insiders who are reading Advaita carefully, they mean very different things. And each of these models can be applied, and I think we should be open-minded now, not like eternally hesitant. We can apply these models to address the hard problem in genuinely different ways. And will their answers be any better? I don't really think so, but there will be different answers. So that's all I can say, that there will be different answers, but all good things have to come to an end. And I know that you have been so kind in your time and letting this conversation go. I'll just invoke Kalidasa, who sees Shiva in all the forms of materiality. Let me conclude that way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ya srishtihi srasturadya vahati vidhutam ya havir ya chahotri yadve kalam vidattaha sruti vishaya guna ya sthita vyapya vishwam ya mahu sarva bija prakritiritiya ya praninaha pranavantaha प्रत्यक्षाभि प्रसन्नस्तनुभिरवतु वस्ताभिरष्टाभिरीशः।